Hello everyone, and welcome to the third webisode in a new to 2014 webinar series focused on suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. We are now going to get started. My name is Meg Schellenberg, and I'm a knowledge broker here at the Commission. I'll be facilitating the webinar today. Before I introduce one of our amazing speakers, Tim Wall from Clinic Community Health Center in Winnipeg, I just wanted to spend a minute to go over some of the housekeeping items as well as an overview of the Commission and our role in suicide prevention, postvention, and intervention. I also wanted to mention that today's webinar is an hour in length with 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. If we don't get to your question at the end of the presentation, you can either email us or join us in a conversation on the Commission's Collaborative Spaces. A link to Collaborative Spaces will be found at the end of this presentation or by visiting the Commission's website. Something that's very important, I see that a few of you have been introducing yourselves on the chat function that can be found to the right of your screen. But it would be great if you could, when addressing yourselves in the chat function, to send your messages to all participants. You can see in the drop-down menu that there is an option for all participants, so please write your messages with that checked off. I also wanted to mention that this webinar is being recorded so it can be archived on the Commission's website following the presentation. A French version of the slides will also be available in the coming week or two. Due to the large number of participants today, you're all on mute. If you have a question for me only, please send it to the host, which can also be found in that drop-down box. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Commission, we were formed in 2007 with a 10-year mandate, which is visible on your screen. We're a catalyst for a system and social change that leads to improved mental health for Canadians. We work closely with the people and organizations that have a role in transforming the mental health system. Now in the second half of our mandate, we're shifting from knowledge generation to a stronger focus on facilitating and creating change. Currently our work is focused on 5 priority areas, suicide prevention being one of them. All of our work is informed by the Mental Health Strategy of Canada, which was released in 2012. The Commission is committed to the prevention of suicide in Canada and has made work in this area a top priority. Alongside our efforts to address suicide prevention in the mental health strategy, the Commission is collaborating with many partners to increase capacity for suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. These partnerships will help raise awareness of the importance of acting to prevent suicide and enhance our understanding of effective suicide prevention programs that can be deployed within Canada. The purpose of this webinar series is to share knowledge and highlight promising practices both within Canada and internationally. By doing so, we hope to create a platform in which people can speak openly and honestly about suicide and come away with a better understanding of the issue. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Tim Wall. Tim is the Executive Director for the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention and Director of Counseling at Clinic Community Health Center, where he has worked for the past 35 years. Clinic is the home of the Manitoba Trauma-Informed and Education Center, which is dedicated to enhancing the capacity of service providers and organizations to effectively meet the needs of people affected by psychological trauma. For the past 10 years, Tim has been actively involved in promoting the importance of trauma-informed practices and creating ACE-informed healthcare and human service systems. So Tim, over to you.
Well, thank you, Meg. I'd like to start this webinar with a story to sort of exemplify what it is that I'm talking about and why I think this issue is so important. I will let you know that what I'm going to be covering over the next hour is sort of an abridged version of a presentation and service that I deliver to service organizations around becoming trauma-informed, which is usually about an hour and a half. So given we have much less time, I will be skipping over some of the slides that are contained within this presentation, but you will all have a copy of the full presentation later. So let me share with you a personal story. Quite a number of years ago, when my 2 children were quite small, we adopted a dog. We rescued a dog, a beautiful Sheltie named Fergie. And we were very happy to have this dog in our home. when I told my mother and father about this new addition to our family, I was rather surprised at my dad's response. My dad, who is a very gentle, loving person, reacted in a way that was somewhat out of character for him. He was angry and quite critical of the fact that we had got this dog. And his rather intense reaction to our having a dog went on for several weeks, often criticizing us for bringing this dog into our home and why did we get a dog, et cetera, et cetera. And this began to wear away at me, and I found myself becoming increasingly angry and annoyed with him. So after several weeks, when I was visiting my mother and father, and again my dad had brought up this issue of having the dog, I found myself my anger beginning to boil over, and I was getting ready to confront him because I didn't understand what was the matter with him. Why was he acting this way? But something stopped me, and instead of having an outburst of anger and directing that towards him, I stopped myself and I asked him a question. I said, "Dad, did you ever have a dog when you were a kid?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, what happened to your dog?" And he told me, my grandfather, who was a very cruel and abusive man, he said, "Well, your grandfather got tired of this dog being around the house, so he made me take it out into the field and shoot it." Suddenly, everything made sense to me. I understood what was going on for him. And what was interesting, even though from that point on we did not talk about what had happened to him as a child and to his dog, his attitude towards the dog that we had changed completely. He did a 180. It got to the point where he would become annoyed with us when we did not bring our dog Fergie over for a visit, and he got quite close to the dog. What changed for me was that instead of my continuing to approach this with an attitude of, "What's wrong with you? Why are you acting so weird?" I made a shift, and I asked him, "What happened, Dad? Help me to understand what you're experiencing right now." And that changed the whole conversation. That changed our relationship. Instead of there being conflict, we experienced a moment of real closeness and understanding and compassion. And so if you remember nothing else from this webinar, remember that. That understanding trauma, understanding psychological trauma, is not only about understanding the people that we serve, our clients, our patients, our constituents, whomever. It's about also understanding ourselves and understanding each other. So next slide. So let's begin with one definition of trauma. There are many definitions out there. So Tara Brash said that trauma is when we have encountered an out-of-control, frightening experience that has disconnected us from all sense of resourcefulness or safety or coping or love. And here at Clinic, we quite like that definition. Next slide. So trauma is a universal experience. It is a part of the human experience. It is unavoidable. Next slide, please. Almost all of us participating on this webinar today will have experienced some type of traumatic event in our lives. There are three components of trauma. One is to recognize that it was unpredictable, that it could not be prevented, and it could not be escaped. Next slide, please. So Judith Herman said that the knowledge of horrible events periodically intrudes into public awareness, but it is rarely retained for long. Denial, repression, and dissociation operate on a social as well as an individual level. The issue of trauma, given how that we've all had our own personal experiences with it, can make it all the more difficult for us to talk about, because it can create a sense of discomfort for us. And so we live in a society that often has a little tolerance for other people's suffering. We can maybe tolerate another person's pain or suffering for a short period of time, but prolonged exposure to another person's suffering can result in us beginning to distance ourselves from that person or what it is that they are experiencing. And so we see in our society all sorts of examples of how not only individuals but systems, organizations, and institutions have protected themselves from that pain and suffering by finding ways to deny it. Next slide, please. So the health of our citizens, our very economic productivity, and the stability of our institutions are all being undermined by trauma. Next slide. It is often at the root of poverty, homelessness, and violence, addictions, mental illness, suicide, poor health outcomes, poor academic performance, lower efficiency, and productivity. We see the effects of trauma every day. But even though it is often staring us right in the face, we sometimes fail to make that connection. Being trauma-informed is about developing, enhancing our capacity to see it, to recognize trauma that is all around us, and to be able to be more comfortable to sit with it, and to increase our capacity to be more compassionate towards those who have experienced trauma. Next slide, please. There are many populations that have been profoundly affected by trauma, and First Nations people certainly are one of those groups who've been affected by things such as intergenerational trauma, the impact of colonization, and the residential school experience. Next slide. This slide, which you may not be able to see very well, and I'm not going to spend much time on, really is an effort to help you understand the various paths that trauma can take. That not everyone who has experienced a traumatic event or events will experience an impact that goes on for the rest of their lives. Many people will recover, sometimes very quickly, from the traumatic event, and due to the resources that they have in place, may even grow out of that experience. And we'll touch upon that a little bit more in a few minutes. Other people will have profound effects as a result of the trauma, and we'll see the effects of that being played out across all sorts of systems. Every system within government, within our communities, will be affected in some way by trauma. Even for those systems that might seem quite removed from the issue of trauma. And so to give you an example, recently I had the opportunity to speak to many of the deputy ministers of cabinet here in Manitoba. And so we had deputy ministers representing departments such as transportation, fisheries, conservation, etc. And we assumed that they would likely be thinking, well, what does this have to do with me? What does this have to do with our department? We're not providing that type of a human service. And our response was, because this is important to you, because the vast majority of the people who work for you, your employees, have been affected by trauma. You are seeing the effects of trauma being acted out every day in your workplace. And for that reason, if you want to create a workplace that supports recovery, that supports people to heal from the effects of trauma, you need to be aware of this issue, because every one of us can make a difference in someone's lives. We can all in some way contribute to recovery. I am constantly in the work that I do here at Clinic reminded how sometimes the smallest acts of kindness and compassion are so incredibly powerful. And so by becoming trauma-informed, we increase our capacity to be compassionate, not only to the people we are providing services to, but compassionate to each other and compassionate towards ourselves. Next slide, please. So the impact of trauma can be felt throughout an individual's life in areas of functioning that might seem far removed from the trauma. And again, I'll refer back to the example I gave when I started, the example of my father. Something that seems so far removed from a childhood trauma, but yet was still very much having an effect on him and his interactions with people, that he cared about. Next slide, please. So we can look at trauma and its impact as existing on two continuums. So it can be a single event, there can be multiple events, or the most extreme end of the continuum where you have people who've been affected by war or acts of terrorism. And the impact can also be felt along a continuum to people experience traumatic stress that they might be able to cope with and resolve fairly quickly, to developing post-traumatic stress, as we see in situations such as in the military, where people who are being exposed to the effects of war, and people who develop complex or developmental trauma that might be associated to prolonged childhood abuse or neglect. Next slide, please. And so the results of traumatic events can affect every aspect of our being. It can result in physical problems, emotional problems, social problems, learning problems, and existential problems or spiritual problems. So trauma affects our emotional, our physical, our relational, and our spiritual health. Next slide, please. The effects of trauma can then include changes to the brain, so that we know that trauma, especially during childhood, actually alters the brain. It has an effect on our neurobiology, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. It leads to increased physical and mental stress. It compromises our immune system. So it's not surprising that when you look at First Nations communities that there are such incredibly high rates of diabetes, which is a result of a compromised immune system, which can be directly linked to the numerous traumatic events and exposure to trauma that First Nations communities will often experience. It can result in decreased stress, decreased trust, so therefore it affects people's ability to engage in help-seeking behavior. It can result in attachment difficulties, so you'll have people developing conflictual relationships, hyperarousal and hypervigilance, so always being on guard, perceiving threats even when no threat exists, or rigid and chaotic behavior. And the effects of trauma are felt across the lifespan. Next slide, please. One of the and some of you will no doubt be familiar with the fight, flight, freeze response. But we know that many people who have been affected by trauma, especially multiple traumas, are very quick to perceive a threat, as I said, even though a threat may not actually exist, and will respond to that threat by either wanting to fight, getting angry, wanting to flee, to run away, or they will freeze, they'll become immobilized. And these reactions become hardwired. They are automatic, instantaneous responses that people have no control over. And I think that this information is critically important and to looking at how we design the programs that we deliver. And I will give you an example. About a year and a half ago, in a meeting I was having with people who are responsible for developing programming for our child and family services, we're talking about some great programs they had developed. They're parenting programs. And they were sharing some of their frustration that, their clients, people who have been involved with the child welfare system here in Manitoba go through these parenting programs, and yet they seem to, after it's over, continue to respond in the same old patterns as they did prior to going to the parenting program. And my response to them was, what I suggested was the program is great. It's not that people didn't understand it and didn't benefit from it, but you've kind of put the cart before the horse. You need to help them do some of that trauma recovery work first. You need to help them rewire some of the circuits in the brain, and we now know how to do that, so that they are no longer prisoners of these fight, flight, freeze responses. Because it's sort of like if you have gone cross-country skiing, if there's been a snowfall and you go out for the first time, and you're the first one going down a trail, that could be kind of difficult. But the more people who go down that trail, you get these ruts, and if you get your skis into those ruts, it's pretty smooth going. It's a lot easier. But try to change direction. When you're in that rut, it is incredibly difficult. It takes a lot of work. And so that's how the brain can react. As a result of trauma, people's responses become hardwired, and it's difficult for them to change that. But because of our knowledge now of the neurobiology of trauma, we now know how to help people to do that. So those are some of the things that we need to be considering integrating into our programming design so that we can assist people to make those changes and then better be in a position to better benefit from some of the other programming and resources we have to offer them. Next slide, please. So it certainly is possible for many people to experience traumatic growth. It's not unusual to hear people say that they are in some ways better off after the trauma than they were prior to that. Now, no one is suggesting that we would wish traumatic events to happen to anyone. They're painful. They result in a great deal of suffering. But people can also grow out of that. So traumatic growth is when an individual has not only survived the experience, but has gone beyond the status quo. And that growth is a direct result of how the individual struggled with the trauma. And the presence of compassionate and trusting relationships played a pivotal role. And that's where we come into play by using this knowledge to better develop those kinds of compassionate and trusting relationships. It is also, as you see on the slide here, it's important that we find ways to help people to not run away from their pain and their suffering. It is all too easy for all of us to do that. In fact, our society, our culture has many things in place that actually assist people to avoid their own pain or suffering. So we avoid other people's pain and suffering, and we put a lot of effort into avoiding our own. But we can teach ourselves, and we can teach others how to be more comfortable with our own hurt, with our own pain, so that we can resolve it. A colleague of mine here uses the example or the metaphor of when we avoid our pain, our suffering, it's like sending it off into the basement. And what is in the basement? Lots of exercise equipment, and our pain works out, and then comes back up the stairs with a vengeance. So if we can help people to develop the skills that allows them to better deal with intense negative emotions, then that will go a long way in supporting them in their recovery and in their well-being. Next slide, please. It is also important that we recognize that many of our people in our workforce who are exposed a lot to people who have experienced trauma may develop traumatic exposure response, or what is often referred to as vicarious trauma. Next slide, please. And so we define trauma exposure response as the transformation that takes place within us as a result of working directly with individuals affected by trauma. And so this applies to many, many, many professions, those working in correctional institutions and law enforcement, police, nurses, social workers, the military, many, many helping professions. Next slide. I want to spend a few moments in talking about the ACE study, which was one of the largest studies ever undertaken that really looked at the issue of adverse childhood experiences, childhood trauma, and its impact. And we certainly encourage every person, every organization to study the ACE study, to make a point of reviewing it, because there's so much important information in there that can help any organization to become more sensitive to this issue and to the needs of people who've been affected by trauma. So next slide. So one of the authors of the study said the chronic public health disaster of adverse childhood effects on human development are real. The first step towards healing people, families, communities, and our institutions comes from understanding the problem. The face of the disaster is in full view, and yet we are often so blind to it. Next slide, please. So here in this pyramid, you can see the development of some of the harmful effects of childhood trauma, beginning with disrupted neurodevelopment, social and emotional cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, and in the most extreme cases, early death, such as with suicide. If we want to really understand suicide more fully and understand its complexity, we need to understand trauma. Many of you will appreciate that there is an overwhelming connection between suicide and trauma. And so CASP, the Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention, recently included in its guidelines that part of suicide prevention includes becoming trauma-informed, so that we can develop resources and services that are better equipped to deal with the many challenges that people experience who have been affected by trauma. Next slide. So one of the things that the ACE study tells us is that the more adverse effects or traumatic events, rather, that a person has experienced in their life, the more profound the experience will be. So if you look at people who report no adverse childhood experiences, 1 in 69 will become an alcoholic. For people who've experienced 1 to 3 ACEs, that increases from 1 to 9, and 4 to 8 ACEs, 1 to 6. So the more traumatic events that somebody experiences, the more difficulties that they are going to experience in life. And the ACE study, again, really emphasizes the enormous link between traumatic events and poor health outcomes. So if we want to really tackle the issue of hallway medicine, for example, if we want to make our healthcare system more effective and also more efficient, then the healthcare system needs to be trauma-informed. We need to address the issue of trauma because we are fairly certain that as we help people recover from trauma, that their health will improve. And we will see some of the chronic illnesses that are really affecting the health of our population over time begin to decrease. Next slide. If you want to learn more about the ACE study, here's one of the websites that you can go to. Next slide. So we're just going to take a couple minutes talking about the neurobiology of trauma. So Davidson said, who we are today is not who we need to be tomorrow. And all the science around trauma and our understanding of how it affects the brain is providing us with not only great insights and understanding, but a great deal of hope. And here at Clinic, when we talk to people, our clients who've been affected by trauma, about the neurobiology of trauma, about how trauma affects them and how it affects their brain, the response is almost always universal, a huge sense of relief. People respond by saying, oh, it's not me, I'm not crazy. There's a reason for why I'm having these difficulties. And so, next slide. We see how trauma affects brain development in early childhood. It impairs the connection of brain circuits and in extreme cases results in actual smaller brain development. It may cause development of low thresholds for stress, resulting in overreactivity or chronic hyperarousal. High levels of stress hormones, including cortisol, also suppress the body's immune system, as I've said previously. And that sustained high levels of cortisol can damage the hippocampus, which is responsible for learning and memory. So cognitive deficits can continue well into adulthood. Next slide, please. If we take from next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. If we take a moment just to consider the 9 functions of a healthy brain. The cortex, or what is sometimes referred to as the upstairs brain. We see 9 functions: body awareness, an ability to attune to others, having balanced emotions, ability to calm fears, ability to pause before acting, capable of insight and reflection, ability to feel empathy, capable of having a sense of morality and fairness, and ability of being intuitive. Given that trauma affects the prefrontal cortex and will potentially affect all of those functions, it's not surprising that people who have experienced especially repeated traumatic events in their life are going to struggle in some of these areas. The next slide, please. So it's important to remember that trauma lives in the nervous system, and that trauma trumps logic every time. I'll share with you another little story. I live out in the country, and I love going out for walks with my dog. But I also have a snake phobia, which sometimes makes it a little challenging living out in the country. So I'll be out for a walk with my dog, and I'll see something on the path before us, and I will jump, and my heart will start racing, and I react immediately. And then I look down and go, oh, it's just it was a stick. I calm down, and I go on my way. For people who have experienced trauma, not only are they always on the lookout for those sticks, when they perceive one, the alarm doesn't get turned off. It will go on for a considerable period of time. There isn't a quick recovery time. And so you might see somebody still in that hyper state of fear, and anxiety the day after something happened. And if you are not trauma informed, you are very likely to misinterpret their behavior. It's like the alarm system is always turned on. And if you don't understand that, as I said, you are likely going to often misinterpret people's behavior and respond to it in a way that is not particularly helpful. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip over that slide. Next one. So one of the things that is so important is to look at trauma as an injury. And as I demonstrated in the story that I led with, it changes the questions that we ask. It changes the whole conversation that we're having with people. It is about asking what has happened to you rather than what is wrong with you. Next slide. Next slide, please. So service providers and service organizations can and do re-traumatize people, which harms and impedes their recovery. Also, service providers and service organizations, regardless of their role and their mandate, can support and nurture recovery, hope, and resiliency. Everyone within an organization or a system, it is our belief, should be trauma-informed. We are not trying to create turn people into trauma specialists, but we are trying to increase their capacity to be able to recognize trauma and to respond in ways that are more helpful, and at minimum avoid re-traumatizing people any further. And we know that systems and organizations unintentionally do that every day. And so that the knowledge, the information about trauma belongs to everyone. It's not privileged information. Now, certain people within an organization or system may have more information than others, but everyone should have a certain minimum amount of information about trauma. Next slide, please. So what is a trauma-informed system? Well, a trauma-informed system, first of all, we talk about the 3 R's. It realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for healing. Next slide. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in staff, in clients, and others who may be involved in the system. Next slide. And finally, it responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, practices, and settings. Next slide, please. So human service systems expect that service providers should be objective, compassionate, empathically attuned, and demonstrate unconditional positive regard for clients and for each others. Yet we usually do very little to actually help service providers to accomplish those goals. Simply putting it in a job description that you expect people to be non-judgmental and to be compassionate, to be empathic, doesn't make it happen. We, especially those in leadership positions, have a responsibility to help people develop those abilities and those capacities. And what's interesting is that the very same tools that we use to help people overcome the effects of trauma also help service providers to become more empathic and to become more compassionate. Next slide. So organizations and systems that are trauma-informed are more accessible, they're more efficient, they're more effective, they're more compassionate, and they're healthier. They're healthier for the people who are receiving the services, and they're healthier for the people who are delivering or providing the services. Next slide. So trauma-informed systems also reduces individual and systemic frustration, fear and anxiety, and judgment. When we use what we know about trauma to better understand people, we are much less likely to become frustrated with people, to become angry, to become impatient, and we will become more compassionate. Now, I do want to interject here that when we talk about compassion, what we are referring to is a willingness not only to sit with another person's suffering, but to do all that we can to help alleviate that suffering. It does not mean that we excuse bad behavior. We still have, there's still a need to hold people accountable for their behavior. And actually, when we integrate trauma-informed approaches into the way that we work, it is actually much easier to help people assume responsibility for themselves and their behavior. Next slide, please. So trauma-informed care provides a foundation for a basic understanding of the psychological, neurological, biological, relational, and spiritual impacts of trauma and violence on individuals receiving service within an organization. Next slide, please. So we're going to quickly look at what the core principles of trauma-informed practices are. Next slide. The core guiding principles of trauma-informed care are safety, trustworthiness, compassion, collaboration, choice and control, cultural competence, empowerment and strength-based approaches, appreciating the interconnectedness of the mind, body, and spirit, and placing a high value on staff wellness. Next slide, please. And to create a trauma-informed organization system, that requires leadership. Leadership that initiates and or promotes organizational change that's consistent with trauma-informed practices and principles. Leadership that develops a strategy for strengthening TIP over time, and considers the resources and the organizational capacity and pressures in developing TIP plans. And all staff must contribute to this. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm going to skip a few slides here. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. I've been talking a lot about compassion. And one of the things that we ask organizations to do is to consider how compassionate is your organization. And there's actually a great quiz or survey that people can take that asks that questions and helps to determine how compassionate a workplace might be. And so I put here up on the screen the website that you can go to look at that and take part of that quiz. Here at Clinic, we're actually going to be asking, it will be voluntary, all of our staff to take the quiz so that we can get a better sense of how compassionate we are as an organization. Next slide, please. We also think that being trauma-informed does help promote psychologically, helping to create a workplace that's psychologically safe. And I would refer people to this website to explore further what it means to be psychologically safe and how organizations can promote that and systems. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, one of the places that an organization can start in the process of becoming trauma-informed and keeping in mind that this process can go on for years. It begins with a commitment to begin that process, recognizing the value that this will have to an organization or a system, and beginning a process that might take years. You never really fully arrive. It's always a work in progress. But the first area is looking at doing an organizational assessment. that considers looking at what is the administrative commitment to change, is the leadership behind this, looking at universal screening, looking at what training and education is available and can be provided to staff, looking at your hiring practices, so hiring people that are trauma-informed or at least have some knowledge about that or are open to that, reviewing your policies and procedures, looking at them from the lens of somebody who has been impacted by trauma, and considering, do these policies, do these procedures have the potential to re-traumatize someone, to re-trigger them. Ensuring that there is good clinical supervision and support for staff to help them with their ongoing professional development in terms of working from a trauma-informed perspective, and also minimizing the effects of vicarious trauma, and making what is the organization's commitment to organizational health and healing. Now, I want to back up and just say a few things about universal screening. We believe it is important that, especially for any human service, that service provider, that organization, has some understanding of what every person's experience of trauma has been, to know what traumatic events they may have experienced in their lives and how that may have impacted them. By asking those questions, and it's up to the service provider and the organization to determine who's going to ask those questions, when you're going to ask those questions, and how much information you are going to collect. That will vary from organization to organization. But by making those inquiries of people, I think demonstrates a number of things. One, it demonstrates that this is a safe place for you to talk about experiences that you may have had in your past that are painful, that we want to understand you. We want to understand what has happened to you, because we recognize that those past experiences can have an effect on who you are today. Again, reinforcing that notion that we see trauma as an injury. This is not about a character flaw. And I'll give you another quick example. Years ago, my former mother-in-law, who worked at a personal care home, was describing an incident that had happened at work where a very elderly woman was having some kind of reaction. She was very, very distressed, feeling out of control. The staff did not know how to respond to it. They took her into her room, they restrained her, and they sedated her. And when she was describing this to me, I said, gee, if I didn't know any better, I would say she was having a flashback to some very painful experience in her past. Several days later, my mother-in-law came back to me, and she said, you know, I shared that with what you said with the staff, and they made some inquiries and found out that actually this woman had been horrifically abused as a child, and in fact she was having a flashback. And even though she had been a resident for a number of years in that facility, no one had ever asked. No one had ever made an attempt to find out what her history was. And if they would have known that, perhaps they would have reacted a little bit differently. Next slide, please. So there are a number of ways that an organization can begin the process of doing a self-assessment, and I put up some of the tools that are available online to do that assessment. And I would encourage all of you to take a look at some of them, just to give you an idea of some of the information we think it's really critical to be sharing with staff in a workplace. I'll draw your attention to the very last one on there, the Trauma Informed Toolkit. I'll be putting up a website in just a moment. The Trauma Informed Toolkit was developed here at Clinic, and it does include a fairly extensive self-assessment tool that was actually developed by Nancy Poole and her colleagues at the BC Centre for Excellence in Women's Health. Next slide. So in creating a trauma-informed system, as I said, that it begins with a commitment to become trauma-informed, and then identifying the trauma champions or leaders within an organization, that there is someone, and preferably more than one, a person who's identified as having a point of responsibility within the system to lead a trauma-informed agenda, and that everyone within the organization knows that it's that person's role and responsibility to always be thinking trauma first, always be bringing those questions about trauma, bringing them forward in conversations, and so that people know that given that is their role, that is sanctioned by the leadership, people are not then rolling their eyes saying, "Oh, there goes Tim again," but there's a recognition that the organization values and sees a real importance on becoming trauma informed. As I said, it's adopting universal screening. It's training all staff, reviewing the policies and procedures, and integrating the knowledge, especially around the ACE study, into service delivery and practices. Next slide. Next slide. So, trauma-informed programs teach not only clients, they also teach staff skills in the following areas. They teach them how to become more self-soothing, how to be more trusting of themselves, how to regulate difficult or painful emotions, how to be self-compassionate, how to set limits, and to be more assertive. It's about communicating needs and desires to other people, to have accurate perceptions of others, to appreciate mutuality and reciprocity, and to recognize fight, flight, freeze responses. Now, those first skill sets around the self-soothing and knowing how to be self-calming, we know that those teaching people how to develop those practices, those sort of mindful practices, contemplative practices, go a long way in some of that rewiring of the brain, reestablishing new circuits within the brain that allows people to not only better cope, but to be able to integrate new information. We also know that that these skills are important in helping staff, especially those working in human services, to remain calm when they are presented with a client that might be very distressed, agitated, or angry. And that is critically important to our interventions and in modeling the kind of behavior we would like to see others engage in. So here at Clinic, we have a program called Life in Balance, where we offer mindfulness-based stress reduction groups, weekly meditation groups, yoga, qigong, a whole series of programs that our clients can participate in on a weekly basis, on a drop-in basis at no cost. And the response has been quite incredible. We have noted that those people that are engaged in those sorts of developing those skills, developing those kinds of mindful practices, are much more engaged in other therapeutic processes, such as traditional talk therapy. And when they do go through a counseling process, they tend to go through it much quicker. And they realize far more benefits. But not only are we making that available to all of our staff or all of our clients, we make it available to all of our staff. And sometimes they're able to actually do it on work time, because we see it as being critically important to promoting good client care and good customer service, but also creating a healthy and safe workplace. Next slide. So just a couple of other slides before we end. These are some of what we see as being the key components for establishing a process for becoming trauma-informed. So just to recap, familiarize yourself and your staff with the ACE study. identify the ACE findings that are most relevant to your workplace, identify the trauma champions or leaders within your organization, review your organizational culture, and I skipped over those slides, but after this webinar you can go back and take a look at those slides, undertake an organizational self-assessment, and establish a TIP, Trauma-Informed Practices Working Group. Next slide. So continued. Identify and include TIP as a strategic priority and direction within your organization or system. Provide training to all the staff, and I'm just going to give you some training resources that are available to you. Facilitate conversations, both formal and informal, on how to use knowledge on trauma to reduce re-traumatization. Promote trusting and safe relationships within the organization. And if you don't have one, establish a staff wellness committee. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. So some resources that are available to you to help you in your journey. I've already mentioned the Trauma-Informed Toolkit. This is a second edition, and the toolkit has actually gone all over the world. The response has been not only terrific here in Canada, but also throughout the U.S., Europe, and Southeast Asia. We get requests every week from some part of the world asking for copies of the toolkit, but it is also available online at no cost. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. It can be accessed on our Trauma-Informed website, where you can also learn more about the Manitoba Trauma Information and Education Center. So that's a program here at Clinic Community Health Center that was funded by the province of Manitoba. Our provincial government recognized that it was important to support all of our systems becoming trauma-informed, and they've made a significant investment in establishing the Trauma Resource Center, which is, to the best of my knowledge, the only resource center that's devoted entirely to promoting trauma-informed practices and policies. So the Trauma-Informed website is a resource primarily for service providers and organizations to help them in understand trauma and to use this knowledge. The second website was developed actually as a resource for people who've been affected by trauma. We recognize that many people live in communities, especially rural and remote communities, where they don't have access to services that are going to really help their recovery. So we established this website where people can understand not only what trauma is and its effects, but can learn practices that promote recovery, things that anyone can learn and do in the privacy of their own home. Not that long ago, I was having a conversation with a colleague who lives in another city, who had been working in refugee camps overseas, and was saying how she had been talking to another colleague about all the difficulties she was experiencing as a result of the work she was doing. She was experiencing vicarious trauma, and this mutual colleague suggested that she look at the trauma recovery website, which she did. She reported back to me that she said, and I quote, "It saved my life. It helped me to understand what was happening, but also how better to cope with my own emotions." She, shortly afterwards, was having a conversation with a colleague in Ottawa who did the same kind of work and was describing the same kind of symptoms. She told him, "Check out this trauma recovery website," which he did. And he reported back to her several days later that after going through the website, he hadn't slept in 3 months, and he said, for the first time, I had a full night's sleep. And he was so excited by what he learned and how helpful it was. He was sharing it with colleagues in Switzerland, Sweden, and some other countries. So we were quite excited about that. Next slide, please. If you go to the Trauma Informed website, you'll see trainings that are available, but one of the ones that I want to highlight is we have developed an online trauma training. This was done with funding from the First Nations Inuit Health Branch, so we're very grateful to them, and in partnership with St. Elizabeth Healthcare. So for people who cannot access a live training, you can learn more about trauma and how to develop trauma-informed relationships that are based in safety and trust and online. And the feedback that we have received has been very, very helpful. This year, this fall, November 3rd and 4th, in Manitoba, we will be hosting the second provincial forum on trauma. Our first one was in 2007, and the results of that first forum were so incredibly positive that we are having another forum to look at how we can better engage organizations and systems into a process of becoming trauma-informed. While the focus is going to be on Manitoba, it is open to anyone across the country who might like to come and observe or participate and take back what they see and what they learn to their communities to help get that started there. And finally, the last slide, please. Carl Bard said, though no one can go back and make a brand new start, anyone can start from now and make a brand new ending. And I think that's one of the other powerful messages about being trauma-informed. It really is a message of hope and resiliency. And people no longer have to be prisoners of their past. We can help liberate people from their past. It doesn't mean that they forget about the past, but they don't have to be locked into ways of coping that don't serve them well, and they can go on to lead much happier and healthier lives. And at that, I will stop and open it up for any questions or comments that people might have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tim. I know that the Commission is increasingly using these guiding principles of trauma-informed care in our work, and based on the enormous amount of feedback that we've been hearing throughout your presentation, there are lots of people out there who are also working on trauma-informed care and have posted quite a few resources and links, so thank you, everybody, for doing that. Before we start on the question session, I want to apologize for some background noise happening here in the Ottawa office. We seem to have a drill hammer outside of our window, so if there's some background noise, I do apologize. So Tim, the first question that we have for you is, how does being trauma-informed support suicide prevention, and how does it help organizations to become suicide safer?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, as I already mentioned, there's a real link between between trauma and suicide, and I think that preventing suicides includes knowing how to promote a trauma recovery. And so I think that if we want to make our services more effective, our suicide prevention services more effective and more accessible to people, then integrating these practices will help accomplish that. So that's in a nutshell. Yeah.
Great. Another question that we've had is around peer support, and they ask, how can peer supporters who have been traumatized themselves support their peers who have been traumatized without becoming re-traumatized?
Well, that's another excellent question, and something that we certainly struggle with here at Clinic all the time. One of our programs is around suicide bereavement, and we often have people who are survivors of suicide themselves. They go on to want to support other people who are unfortunately new to the trauma of a suicide death. And that's a really important issue. First of all, I think we as an organization feel a responsibility that when people have that interest, that we spend a lot of time talking to people about their readiness to take on that work and to look at what their healing processes has been, and what are the things that they have in place that helps them recognize when they're being triggered, to recognize and identify their cues, their emotions that tell them, okay, I'm now beginning to respond in a way to what I'm hearing that's probably not going to be helpful to me or this other person, and to be able to stop that process, and that they have practices in place that help them to, as I said earlier, to be more self-soothing and self-calming, and to regulate those difficult emotions. Babette Rothschild, who some of you might know, has done a lot of writing in the area of trauma, says that you never teach someone how to drive until you've taught them how to use the brakes. And I think when it comes to working with peers, we need to make sure that they know how to use the brakes and know when to use them. And also that they are equipped to help other people who are newly affected to learn how to apply the brakes. One of the things that we tell people, it is not necessary, nor is it helpful, especially in the early stages, to be getting a lot of detail from people about their story, about what happened. That can be that can be potentially harmful. So it is helping people to contain some of that storytelling so that nobody gets overwhelmed by it. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and I think we had some follow-up questions to that. One being, what if an individual who demonstrates post-traumatic symptoms is not receptive to identifying what the traumatic experience was?
Well, we don't. We're not suggesting that. It's not our role to convince someone that they've been traumatized. They have experienced a traumatic event. I think we can ask that question and gently explore that. But if somebody is seeming uncomfortable with that, resistant, then we honor that. And what I try to do is I just keep that in the back of my head. I try to interpret what I'm seeing from a trauma-informed way. So they may not recognize that there's been a trauma, but I might be saying to myself, I still recognize that there's probably a lot of evidence that would suggest that, in fact, they have been affected by a trauma in some way. So that helps to inform the way that I talk to a person. I just keep that in mind and trying to interpret their behavior from that through that lens.
Great. And then the second follow-up question to that, along the same lines, is when people who are triggered respond based on traumatic experience, we always tend to look for fight and flight examples. Does tend and befriend present differently?
I'm sorry? It does
tend
what?
and befriend? Does it present differently?
I'm not sure I know what is meant by that.
Okay. Elisa, I know that you asked that question in the chat function, so if you were able to elaborate on that, that would be great. Tend and befriend is a response associated, so I'm not too sure either what she's referring to, but perhaps we can respond to that question through collaborative spaces following this presentation. So Tim, the final question that we have is around the workplace. And so we talked a lot about how trauma-informed practices are being integrated into organizations, and we're wondering how being trauma-informed can help an organization save money, and what the cost benefits of being trauma-informed are.
I think that there are a lot of cost benefits. I don't have research that backs it up right now. But I think that when a workplace is trauma-informed, it is promoting, it's doing mental health promotion. As I said many times throughout my presentation, it's placing a great value on staff wellness and the health of staff. And that's going to result in less absenteeism. People are going to get sick less often the healthier that they are, and there is less risk of workplace injuries. We believe that people become more attentive, more self-aware, are going to invest more in protecting themselves and keeping themselves safe in healthy ways. So we think that it reduces a lot of costs to the employer if you just want to look at it in those in those sort of strictly economic terms.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for your presentation today. It was very informative. Tim's information is available on your screen, so if you would like to connect with him directly, you can reach out to him through email or phone. My information, Meg Schellenberg, is also up there. For those of you wanting audio recordings or copies of the presentation, you can email myself or Lori Hager, who's been chatting throughout this presentation today. Our next webinar will take place next Tuesday, May 13th, and the focus will be on peer support and suicide prevention. So we hope that you are all able to join us then. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.